I need to provide some context before I get into this story. Last summer, my three best friends from college and I decided to do a cross-country road trip from Boston to Los Angeles. We'd been planning it for over a year, and by the time summer rolled around, we were all beyond excited to finally make it happen. The crew consisted of me, Jake, who was driving, Marcus, and Tyler. We're all in our mid-20s and had just graduated, so this felt like our last real chance to do something like this before life got too serious with jobs and responsibilities. The first few days of the trip were amazing. We drove through Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana without any issues. We'd stop at weird roadside attractions, eat at local diners, and just enjoy the freedom of being on the open road. But on day 4, somewhere in the middle of Missouri, things started to feel off. We'd been driving for about 8 hours straight, and everyone was exhausted, so we decided to find a motel for the night. Jake pulled off at this random exit that advertised food and lodging. The town itself was tiny, maybe a few hundred people, and it had this uncomfortable vibe that's hard to describe. Everything just felt too quiet and too empty. The motel we found was one of those old roadside places that probably peaked in the 1970s. It had about 15 rooms in a single-story L-shaped building with the office at the corner. The neon sign out front was half burned out and the parking lot was completely empty except for one beat-up sedan. We almost kept driving to find something better, but we were all too tired to care. Jake went into the office to get us rooms while the rest of us waited in the car. He came back a few minutes later looking uncomfortable. He said the guy at the desk was really weird, asking a lot of personal questions about where we were from and where we were headed. Jake had tried to keep his answers vague, but the guy was persistent. We got 2 rooms next to each other, rooms 7 and 8. They were exactly what you'd expect from a cheap roadside motel: outdated furniture, questionable stains on the carpet, and that musty smell that never quite goes away. But we were too tired to care. Tyler and I took room 7, while Jake and Marcus took room 8. We agreed to meet up in about an hour to find somewhere to eat dinner. I was lying on the bed scrolling through my phone when Tyler came out of the bathroom looking pale. He told me to come look at something. In the bathroom, behind the door, someone had carved words into the wall. It said, "They watch you sleep," in crude letters that had been painted over but were still visible. We both laughed it off as some weird attempt to freak out guests, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't make me uncomfortable. We decided not to mention it to Jake and Marcus because we didn't want to seem paranoid. About 45 minutes later, Jake texted our group chat saying he'd seen someone walk past their window twice, stopping to look in each time. Marcus confirmed it, saying the person had definitely been staring directly into their room through a gap in the curtains. Tyler and I immediately checked our window and made sure the curtains were completely closed. We all agreed to meet outside our rooms and go get food together. When we left, I noticed the same beat-up sedan that had been in the parking lot earlier was now parked directly in front of our rooms. I was certain it had been parked near the office before. We found a diner about 10 minutes away and spent the next hour there, mostly talking about how creepy the motel was. Jake suggested we just drive through the night and forget about staying there, but we were all too exhausted. We agreed to go back, lock everything, and leave first thing in the morning. When we got back to the motel around 9 p.m., the sedan was gone. The parking lot was completely empty again, except for Jake's car. Tyler and I went into our room and immediately checked to make sure everything was how we'd left it. Nothing seemed disturbed, but that uneasy feeling was stronger now. Around midnight, I woke up to Tyler shaking my shoulder. He whispered that he'd heard someone trying the door handle. I stayed completely still and listened. After about 30 seconds, I heard it too, the quiet sound of someone turning the handle, testing if it was locked. My heart was pounding. I grabbed my phone and texted Jake, asking if he was awake. He responded immediately, saying he and Marcus had been hearing the same thing for the past 20 minutes. We could hear footsteps outside, moving between our 2 rooms. Whoever it was would try one door, then walk to the other room and try that door, then come back. This went on for at least 10 minutes. Then everything went quiet for a while, and I started to think maybe whoever it was had given up. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. There was a scratching sound coming from the window. Someone was scraping something metal against the glass, right where the curtain gap was. Tyler and I both froze. The scratching continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. I texted Jake that we needed to get out of there now. He agreed immediately. The four of us coordinated over text, agreeing to open our doors at the same time and run to Jake's car. We counted down from 3, then burst out of our rooms at the same moment. Standing in the parking lot directly between our 2 rooms was a man in dark clothes. In the dim light from the motel sign, I could see he was holding something in his hand that looked like a knife or a screwdriver. We didn't say anything to him. We just ran to Jake's car, threw ourselves inside, and Jake floored it out of that parking lot. As we were driving away, I looked back and saw the man just standing there in the same spot, watching us leave. The beat-up sedan was back, parked in front of the office. We drove for another 2 hours before finally stopping at a well-lit chain hotel near a highway. None of us slept well that night, and we never talked about stopping at random motels again for the rest of the trip. I still wonder sometimes who that person was and what they wanted. And I think about that message carved in the bathroom wall. They watch you sleep. And wonder how many other people have had similar experiences at that motel. This happened to me about 3 years ago when I was driving from Seattle to visit my brother in Denver. It's about a 20-hour drive, so I'd planned to do it over 2 days with an overnight stop somewhere in Montana or Wyoming. I left Seattle early in the morning and made good time through Washington and into Idaho. By early evening, I was crossing into Montana and starting to think about finding a place to stop for the night. That's when I made a mistake that I still regret. I'd been so focused on making good time that I'd let my gas tank get dangerously low. I was in one of those stretches of highway where there's nothing for miles in either direction, and my gas light had been on for at least 20 minutes. I was starting to genuinely worry about running out of gas when I finally saw a sign for a gas station at the next exit. I'd never been so relieved to see those signs in my life. The exit took me off the highway and onto a 2-lane road that stretched into nothing but dark fields and distant mountains. The gas station was about 2 miles from the highway, completely isolated from anything else. As I pulled into the parking lot, I immediately got a bad feeling. The place looked abandoned. Most of the lights were off and I couldn't see anyone inside the building, but the pumps still had power, and at that point, I didn't have much choice. I pulled up to a pump and got out of my car. That's when I noticed the other vehicle in the parking lot, a large van with tinted windows parked near the edge of the lot in the shadows. Something about it made me uneasy, but I tried to ignore the feeling. I swiped my credit card at the pump, but it was declined. I tried 2 more cards, but none of them worked. The pump just kept saying, "See cashier." I didn't want to go inside, but I needed gas. I walked to the door of the station and found it locked. Through the grimy windows, I could see that the lights were on in the back, but the main area was dark and empty. I knocked on the door and waited. After about 30 seconds, I saw movement in the back. A man appeared from a doorway and slowly walked toward the front. He was probably in his 50s, wearing dirty coveralls, and he had this intense stare that made me uncomfortable. He unlocked the door but didn't open it all the way. He just stood there in the gap looking at me expectantly. I explained that I needed gas, but the pump wouldn't take my cards. He said their card reader had been broken for days, and I'd have to pay cash inside. The problem was I didn't have much cash on me, maybe $40 at most. I told him I only had $40 and asked if I could just get that amount of gas. He stared at me for a long moment, then said he needed to see my ID before he could turn on the pump. That struck me as odd. I'd bought gas thousands of times and never been asked for ID just to pay cash, but I was desperate, so I pulled out my wallet and showed him my driver's license through the gap in the door. He looked at it for a long time, much longer than necessary. Then he asked where I was heading. When I told him Denver, he got this strange look on his face and said something like, "Long way to go by yourself." He finally stepped back and opened the door wider, telling me to come inside to pay. Everything in my gut told me not to go in there, but I didn't know what else to do. The inside of the station was dim and smelled like old cigarettes and mildew. There was a counter with a register, but everything else was covered in dust and looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I handed him the $40, and he slowly counted it, then recounted it. While he was doing this, I heard a sound from the back room, what sounded like someone moving around. I asked if someone else was working, and the man's expression changed. He said no, probably just the building settling, but I definitely heard something. He finally turned on the pump and told me to go ahead. I practically ran back to my car and started pumping gas. That's when I noticed the van had moved. It was now parked much closer to my car, only a few spaces away. I was certain it had been at the edge of the lot before. My hands were shaking as I pumped the gas. I kept looking between the station and the van, expecting something to happen. When the pump stopped at exactly $40, I didn't waste any time. I put the nozzle back, got in my car, and started the engine. As I was pulling out of the parking lot, I saw the door to the van slide open. Two men started to get out, but I was already speeding toward the exit. In my rearview mirror, I could see them standing there watching me drive away. I drove for another hour before I felt safe enough to stop again, and when I did, I made sure it was at a busy, well-lit station with plenty of other people around. The next morning, I looked up the gas station on my phone to see if I could find any information about it. What I found made me feel sick. There were multiple reviews warning people to avoid that station, with stories remarkably similar to mine. Several people mentioned being approached by men in a van, and at least 2 reviews mentioned that the station seemed to be operating some kind of scam or worse. I reported my experience to the Montana State Police, but I don't know if anything came of it. I just know that I'll never let my gas tank get that low again, and I'll never stop at an isolated station like that, no matter how desperate I am. This is something that happened to my dad in the early 1990s, but he only told me about it a few years ago. I'm sharing it because it's one of the most disturbing stories I've ever heard, and it happened during what should have been a routine road trip. My dad was in his early 30s at the time and was driving from Phoenix to Albuquerque for a work conference. He'd made the drive dozens of times before, so he knew the route well. It was late afternoon when he was somewhere in the middle of New Mexico, driving through one of those endless stretches of desert highway. He told me that he usually never picked up hitchhikers, but he saw this guy standing on the side of the road in the blazing heat, and he felt bad for him. The guy looked to be in his 20s, wearing jeans and a t-shirt, with a small backpack at his feet. He had his thumb out, but wasn't being aggressive about it. My dad said something about him just looked legitimately stranded, so he pulled over. The guy jogged up to the car and thanked my dad profusely for stopping. He said his car had broken down about 10 miles back, and he'd been walking for over an hour trying to find help. He asked if my dad could give him a ride to the next town, which was about 30 miles away. My dad agreed, and the guy got in the passenger seat. For the first 10 minutes or so, everything seemed normal. The guy was friendly and talkative, asking my dad about where he was from and where he was headed. But then the conversation started to get weird. The guy began asking increasingly personal questions. Where exactly in Albuquerque was my dad staying? Was he traveling alone? Did anyone know his route? My dad started giving vague answers and tried to change the subject, but the guy was persistent. Then he asked something that made my dad's blood run cold. "Do you have any cash on you?" My dad immediately tensed up. He said he had maybe $20, hoping that would satisfy whatever the guy was thinking. The hitchhiker just nodded and went quiet, staring straight ahead at the road. After a few minutes of uncomfortable silence, my dad noticed something in his peripheral vision. The hitchhiker was slowly reaching into his backpack, moving deliberately so as not to draw attention. My dad's mind was racing. He knew something was wrong, but he was going 70 miles per hour on a desert highway with no other cars in sight. If he tried to force the guy out, there was no telling what would happen. That's when he had an idea. He started talking about how he was actually a police officer, heading to a law enforcement conference in Albuquerque. He made up details about his work, dropping in law enforcement terms he'd picked up from TV shows and movies. The hitchhiker's hand stopped moving in the backpack. He asked my dad what kind of police work he did. My dad kept the story going, saying he worked in armed robbery and that he was carrying his service weapon in the glove compartment. The hitchhiker pulled his hand out of the backpack slowly, empty. He went completely silent, staring out the window. My dad kept up the cop story for the next 20 minutes, adding more and more details to make it convincing. When they finally reached the next town, my dad pulled into a busy gas station parking lot. He told the hitchhiker this was where he needed to stop for gas, and the guy could get help inside. The hitchhiker didn't say anything, just grabbed his backpack and got out of the car quickly, walking away from the station toward a side street. My dad waited until the guy was out of sight, then drove straight to an actual police station in the town. He told them everything that had happened and gave a description of the hitchhiker. The officer he spoke to got very serious and asked my dad to repeat the description. Apparently, there had been a string of armed robberies along that stretch of highway over the past few months, all involving a man who would hitchhike and then rob the drivers who picked him up. 2 of the incidents had turned violent. The police put out an alert, but as far as my dad knows, they never caught the guy. Years later, my dad told me that what made him most uncomfortable about the whole thing was something he noticed as the hitchhiker was walking away from the gas station. Through the car window, he could see into the guy's open backpack. Inside was a knife, duct tape, and several sets of zip ties. My dad is convinced that if he hadn't pretended to be a cop, he would have been robbed at the very least, and possibly much worse. He said he's never picked up a hitchhiker since, and he never will again. This story has always stuck with me because it shows how quickly a simple act of kindness can turn into a life-threatening situation. My dad was just trying to help someone in the desert heat, and he nearly became another victim of a serial criminal. I've driven that same stretch of highway a few times since then, and I always think about my dad's story when I pass through. I see hitchhikers sometimes standing on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere, and I never stop, because you never really know who you're letting into your car.